Have you ever watched a man spend 30 years building something that the world decided it no longer needed, and then watched that same world come crawling back? Let me tell you about Ned Colby. Ned grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, in a house that sat close enough to the railroad tracks that the windows rattled every time the evening freight came through. His father repaired farm equipment. His grandfather repaired farm equipment. There wasn't a machine within 20 miles of that hollow that one of the Colby men hadn't laid hands on at some point, and there wasn't a farmer who didn't know it. Ned didn't go to college. He didn't want to. He had a gift, the kind that doesn't come from a textbook, and he knew it young. By the time he was 17, he could listen to a diesel engine idle for 30 seconds and tell you which cylinder was misfiring. Not guess, tell you. His father called it hearing the hurt in things. Ned just called it paying attention. When he was 23, Ned Colby rented a corner of a converted feed barn outside of Hazard and opened a one-man shop. He didn't have a sign for the first 2 years. He didn't need one. Word got around the way word always gets around in small Kentucky counties, quietly, reliably, one handshake at a time. He specialized in hydraulic systems, not just any hydraulics, the old kind. The kind bolted onto mid-century farm equipment that the manufacturers had long since stopped supporting. International harvester tractors from the 60s. Alice Chalmers combines that had been running since before most of their owners were born. Vintage excavators that county road crews still relied on because they couldn't afford replacements. These were machines built before the era of throwaway parts, machines designed to last 70 years if someone cared for them right. And caring for them right was exactly what Ned Colby did. His specialty was the hydraulic pump. Specifically, the gear-type hydraulic pump found on agricultural machinery from roughly 1955 to 1985. A deceptively simple device that generated the pressure needed to lift implements, drive attachments, steer heavy equipment. When one of those pumps failed, you had a problem. You had a machine that couldn't work. And in farming, a machine that can't work doesn't just cost you money. It costs you time. It costs you the window. You miss the window to plant, you've lost your season. You miss the window to harvest, you've lost your crop. Ned understood this. Farmers understood this. That's why they brought their failed pumps to him. He could rebuild a gear pump from scratch. Not replace it. Rebuild it. He knew the tolerances by feel. He knew which castings cracked and which ones held. He knew how to hone a worn housing back to spec using equipment that most machinists considered museum pieces. He kept a shelf of original manufacturer spec sheets, laminated against grease and time, organized in a system only he fully understood. He kept a drawer of handwritten notes, measurements, observations, failure patterns, going back to his first year in business. The drawer had gotten so full over the decades that he'd had to add a second one, then a third. By his late 30s, Ned had a waiting list. Farmers would drop off a failed pump and wait 2, sometimes 3 weeks for the rebuild. And they did it without complaint because the alternative was hunting for a new pump that either didn't exist anymore or cost 4 times what Ned charged for the rebuild. His reputation spread beyond Harlan County. Pumps came in from eastern Tennessee, from southwestern Virginia, from the southern tip of West Virginia, from places where people still ran old iron and needed someone who understood it. Nobody rebuilding vintage hydraulic pumps in eastern Kentucky was getting rich, but he was doing all right, and more than that, he was doing what he was built to do. He had a shop, a craft, and people who depended on him. For Ned Colby, that was enough. Then, the industry shifted. It happened the way most shifts happen, not all at once, but by degrees. First, it was the parts suppliers. The companies that had been making replacement components for older hydraulic systems started quietly discontinuing product lines. Not announced, not apologized for, just gone. You'd call in an order for a set of gear rotors for a 1968 IH pump, and the voice on the other end would tell you that item had been discontinued. Sorry, no substitute available. Then it was the equipment dealers, the big regional dealers who used to stock rebuild kits for vintage machinery, started clearing that inventory off their shelves. New equipment was selling. New equipment had better margins. Why stock parts for a combine that was older than the salesman? And then came the consultants. His name was Philip Radner. He worked for a regional agricultural equipment consortium, one of those organizations that existed somewhere between a trade association and a lobbying group staffed by people who wore khaki and carried iPads and talked a great deal about the direction of the industry. Ned had never heard of him before the afternoon he showed up at the shop. Radner was polite. Ned would give him that. He didn't walk in with arrogance, exactly. He walked in with the particular brand of cheerful condescension that people develop when they've spent too long advising others on matters they themselves have never performed. He looked around the shop, at the lathes, the drill press, the surface grinder, the shelves of cataloged castings, the way a man looks around a museum. Interested, but not invested. He told Ned that the consortium had been conducting a study on service infrastructure for aging equipment in rural counties. He said that Ned's shop had come up repeatedly in their surveys. He said that what Ned did was, quote, admirable. He said the word like it was a kind of eulogy. He told Ned that the hydraulic systems on pre-1985 equipment were reaching the end of their serviceable lifespan across the region, that within 5 to 10 years, most of the machines Ned worked on would be retired from service, replaced by modern equipment with electronic systems that required certified dealer technicians and proprietary diagnostic tools, not craftsmen with surface grinders. He said the consortium was recommending that independent operators in Ned's position begin planning for transition, whether that meant retraining, partnership with a larger dealer network, or, well, retirement. He was 31 years old. Ned did the math later. Ned listened to all of it. He had his hands on the workbench when Radner was talking, not quite gripping it, just resting there. He looked at the shelf of spec sheets. He looked at the drawer of notes. He thought about the farmer from Letcher County who had called that morning to say his baler's hydraulic pump had seized up, and he had 2 weeks before the hay needed to come in. He thanked Philip Redner for coming out. He shook his hand. He walked him to the door. Then he went back to the workbench, put on his magnifying visor, and got back to work on the pump that was clamped in front of him. That was the only conversation they ever had. Here is what Ned Colby did not do. He did not call a lawyer. He did not write an angry letter. He did not post anything on the internet or tell farmers at the co-op that some consultant in khaki had come to tell him his life's work was obsolete. He did not spend a single afternoon feeling sorry for himself, at least not one that anyone else ever witnessed. What he did do was start collecting. He had always kept parts on hand, a working inventory of cores and components that came in with failed pumps and didn't get returned because they had no value to the owner. Cracked housings, worn gears, bent shafts, things that were by any conventional measure junk. He had kept them in bins, loosely sorted, in the back corner of the shop. After Radner's visit, Ned stopped letting that inventory stay loose. He started organizing it. He started seeking it out. He put the word out to farmers, to implement dealers, to county road departments. If you have old hydraulic pumps you're pulling off equipment, call me before you scrap them. I'll take them. I'll pay a little or I'll work a trade, but don't throw them away. They thought he was being sentimental. A few of them said as much kindly. Old iron for a man who loved old iron. That was how they read it. They dropped pumps at his shop for years. Whole units pulled from machines being taken out of service. Partial assemblies stripped for scrap and then reconsidered. pumps from estates, from farm auctions, from the backs of equipment dealers' warehouses, where they'd sat untouched since the Carter administration. They came in coffee cans and wooden crates and burlap sacks and the beds of pickup trucks. Ned cataloged every one of them. He cross-referenced the castings against his spec sheets. He measured the housings, measured the gears, recorded what was salvageable and what could yield parts even if the whole unit couldn't be saved. His shop began to look, from the outside, like a kind of organized chaos. Shelves that had once held finished inventory now held cores waiting to be evaluated. The back storage unit went up beside the main building. A second storage unit followed 3 years later. Ned built a wooden shelving system himself, one section at a time on winter evenings when the work was slow. His daughter, Tamsin, asked him once, she must have been about 20, home from community college for the summer. She asked him what he was doing with all of it. Why he was spending money to store things that weren't making him money. He thought about it for a while before he answered, which was how Ned answered most questions. He said, because somebody built these right, and building things right doesn't expire. She didn't fully understand it then. She would. The years went on. The predictions that Philip Radner had outlined did come true, in their way, partially. Some of the oldest equipment did retire from service. Some farmers did upgrade to modern machinery, but eastern Kentucky is not a place of easy capital. Farming in the hill counties doesn't generate the margins that allow for frequent equipment replacement. Old iron didn't disappear from those fields. It persisted the way things persist in places where money is tight and land has been worked by the same families for 4 and 5 generations. It persisted because it still ran when it was cared for, and the man who cared for it was Ned Colby. His waiting list got longer, not shorter, partly because he was now one of very few people left in a multi-state region who could do what he did. The others, men who had shared his trade, who had rebuilt pumps and valves and cylinders in small shops scattered through the Appalachian counties, had mostly retired. Some had died. Their inventories had been dispersed or scrapped. Their knowledge had gone with them, unrecorded, unhanded down, simply absent from the world in the way that specialized knowledge becomes absent when the people who hold it stop being alive. Ned was still there. And then, in the span of about 18 months, everything changed. It started with supply chains. The global disruptions that began in 2020 and continued, in various cascading forms, for years afterward, had effects that rippled into corners of the economy that most people didn't think about. The manufacturers of agricultural equipment components, even the modern ones, began experiencing shortages. Lead times for new parts stretched from weeks to months. Some items simply became unavailable, and farmers who had replaced their old equipment with newer machinery found themselves in a position they hadn't expected. Their modern tractors had electronic hydraulic systems that required specific dealer-sourced components that were now back-ordered 4, 5, 6 months. Their combines sat in the barn waiting on a single part. The window to plant was open. The window to harvest was open. The machines couldn't move. Meanwhile, some of their neighbors, the ones who had kept running the old iron, the ones who still brought their gear pumps to Ned Colby, were in the field. Word travels fast in agricultural counties when the difference between making and losing a season is visible from the road. Ned started getting calls from numbers he didn't recognize, from counties he'd never worked in, from dealers who had told their customers for years that the old equipment wasn't worth maintaining, and who now needed someone who could keep those machines running while the new parts pipeline cleared itself. From farmers who had sold off the vintage equipment they'd inherited and now wished desperately that they hadn't. He couldn't take all of it. He was 61 years old by then. He had one full-time employee, a young man named Cabe Worley from down in Lynch, who had apprenticed with him for 4 years and who could now handle much of the standard rebuild work without Ned looking over his shoulder. He hired a second person that fall, a third the following spring. The storage units that the county had regarded for years as the slightly eccentric accumulation of a man who couldn't let go of the past. Those units were now inventory, cataloged, cross-referenced, organized. Ned knew what was in them the way he knew the rooms of his own house. A farmer from Whitley County would call describing a failed pump off a 1972 Alice Chalmers 190, and Ned would pause for a moment and say, "Yes, I think I have the housing you need. Let me check the serial range," and he would go to the second unit, to the third shelf on the left side, and he would come back with a casting that had been sitting there for 11 years, waiting for exactly this moment. What happens to the knowledge? The farmer from Letcher County had asked once, half joking, when Ned's reading glasses started appearing on his workbench. What happens to all of it when you're gone? Ned had started writing it down, not just in his familiar drawer of notes, but in a real way, systematically, with intention. The tolerances, the failure patterns, the cross-references between manufacturer specs and what he'd found in practice to be the actual reliable dimensions, the things that were in no manual anywhere because they'd never been written down by anyone, only learned by hands that had built and rebuilt the same components 1,000 times. Tamsin had come back to the county after her own detour. A decade in Lexington, a career in logistics that she'd found professionally competent and personally hollow. She'd come back when her first child was born, the way people sometimes do, pulled by something older than economics. She had started helping her father with the shop's administration, scheduling, billing, the phone calls, and in doing that, she'd started learning the inventory. And in learning the inventory, she'd started learning why the inventory mattered. And in understanding why it mattered, she had started understanding her father in a way she hadn't before. She asked him once. She was sitting across the workbench from him while he was fitting a set of gears into a rebuilt housing, her 2-year-old asleep in a car seat by the door. She asked him if he'd ever thought about what Radnor had said, whether the man had actually believed what he was saying, or whether he'd just been doing his job. Ned turned the housing in his hands, checking the fit by feel. "Probably both," he said. "Most people who tell you something's over have convinced themselves first. Easier that way." He set the housing down. Thing is, he wasn't entirely wrong. A lot of this equipment did retire. A lot of it is gone. He just didn't account for what would happen to the part that wasn't gone. He picked up a gear, examined the tooth profile under the light. He didn't account for the weight, Ned said. There are things that endure not because they are protected or celebrated, but simply because someone decided, quietly, without announcement, that they were worth keeping. You don't always know at the time why you're keeping them. Sometimes you tell yourself a story about it. Sometimes you just keep going and let the reason reveal itself later. Ned Colby had rebuilt hydraulic pumps for 38 years by the time the calls started coming in from places he'd never heard of. He had rebuilt them through the years when the industry told him he was becoming irrelevant. He had rebuilt them when the parts suppliers quit and the dealers moved on, and the consortium man in khaki came with his iPad and his studied concern. He had rebuilt them in the early mornings before the day's work started, and in the late evenings after everyone else had gone home. He had rebuilt them the way people work at something when they have stopped needing the world's permission to continue. His shop still sits outside of Hazard. The sign out front is newer. Tamsin had it made after the first write-up appeared in an agricultural trade publication, which led to the second write-up which led to inquiries from a university extension program that was trying to document surviving traditional hydraulic service knowledge before it disappeared entirely from the region. The sign says the same thing it always has, just clearer now. Colby Hydraulic Service, Est, 1987. The storage units are still there. 3 of them now running along the east side of the property. They don't look like much from the road. But last spring, when a farmer from over in Perry County came in with a failed pump off a machine that hadn't turned a wheel in 6 years, a machine he'd pulled out of a brushy fence row, because he couldn't get the modern replacement parts he needed, and he'd remembered, suddenly, that the old one was still there. Ned walked him back to the second unit, to the shelves on the left side, and came out with a casting that fit. They stood there in the gravel for a minute, the farmer looking at the part in his hands, and then looking at the units, and then back at Ned. "How long have you had this?" the farmer asked. Ned thought about it. 14 years, give or take. The farmer shook his head slowly. "I called 3 dealers before I called you," he said. "All 3 told me to scrap the machine." Ned took the casting back and turned it in his hands, checking it the way he always checked everything. Not because he doubted himself, but because the habit had kept him right for a long time. "I know," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that sounded like satisfaction or vindication or the particular pleasure of being proved correct. It just sounded like a man who had done the work, who understood why the work mattered, and who had never really needed anyone else to explain it to him. He carried the casting back into the shop. There was another pump on the bench. There was always another pump on the bench. He put on his visor, turned on the light above the workbench, and got back to it.